The real transition in the development of Yorkville is the opening of the elevated lines on 2nd and 3rd Avenue in the late 1870s. And with the opening, it becomes a place where people can live and easily get around.
Well, there was a 2nd Avenue L. It was elevated, you know, and you had to go up these steep steps with the sheds underneath. Some of the older trains had potbelly stoves in them as well.
I remember 3rd Avenue L very clearly. And I liked it. You know, you were always on a little tour when you got onto the 3rd Avenue L because you were looking at the neighborhoods as you went by.
That was a big social event to get on the trains because people would come home at the same time. They would go to work at the same time.
There was a different life under the L. And that's one thing I think people really don't realize. You know, you didn't have these big department stores or anything like that. Those were on the avenues that were free and all that. But under there was all these little tiny hardware stores, the shirt stores, little butcher shops. I mean, it was really, really nice.
The arrival of the elevated trains on 3rd Avenue in 1878 and 2nd Avenue in 1880 catalyzed movement to Upper Manhattan on the East Side. Not only did these elevated rail lines improve accessibility to a rapidly developing Yorkville, they also sparked a frenzy of speculative real estate development east of Lexington Avenue. New dwellings conveniently located near the brand new L's attracted middle and working class residents and strengthened Yorkville's growth as an economically and culturally diverse neighborhood.
First of all, are the tenements.
There are 3 tenement laws that occur over time, 1867, 1879, and 1901. 1867, today we can still see these tenements.
They had railroad flats, as they call them. They were these long apartments that went one room after another, 4 rooms.
Each house had to be 25 feet wide to get as many houses on a lot.
You could raise a family in them, and they did.
The next tenement law, which is 1879, results in indented sides, so essentially kind of like a dumbbell form.
There's a thing called an air shaft, and when 2 buildings were put together, there was like a space in between them, a large space. People could hang their clothing out there on lines and things like that.
1901 Tenement Act results in additional indentations to allow in more natural lights, which are really considered courtyards, and then also fireproof construction or fire escapes was fundamental to all 3 of those acts.
As land values rose in the city, apartment buildings built specifically for the middle class begin to appear, and they begin to be called French flats. They had decent-sized kitchens, and they always had a bathroom. French flats also tended to have larger rooms, so they became respectable places for middle-class families to live. I think the best example of a French flat is the Manhattan.
It was sort of groundbreaking for the neighborhood in that it was the first.
One of the most interesting building types that proliferates in Yorkville is the model tenement. A movement began to try to create a higher quality housing for working people. This was a great advance. One of the most significant model tenement complexes in Yorkville is the Cherokee Apartments.
These were specifically constructed to help tuberculosis patients and their families. Very fine materials, very fine design, and then of course an abundance of natural light and ventilation. So you have the City and Suburban Estates Development Corporation, which builds a series of large-scale model tenement buildings to house the working class. So these were much better ventilated, more natural light.
What's really important, I think, to understand the diversity of the neighborhood with its built form, with row houses and working class tenements and French flats for the middle class, all together create the dynamism of what was and still is the physical fabric of Yorkville. As the neighborhood was becoming more affluent, as immigration was slowing, the potential to redevelop 3rd Avenue was there if the L was gone.
And it was deteriorating. Then the 3rd Avenue L started to come down, and I remember, 77th Street was kind of like the last stop.
It was a big land grab. Everybody was selling their property, and the high-rises started to come in. It was a big building boom.
For decades after the demolition of the elevated trains, Yorkville residents endured famously overcrowded commutes on the Lexington Avenue Irt. It took almost 100 years after the 2nd Avenue subway was first proposed for it finally to be built. Now that the subway's here, the word most often used to describe it is transformative. Travel to and from Yorkville is now easier and more efficient. But what other sorts of transformation will occur? And what might Yorkville lose in the process? What needs to be protected, preserved, and most of all, celebrated?